I would tell you to go ahead, but we're fighting the clock. This is what I'm going to talk about today. And so I'll give you a minute if you want to copy that down. Or take pictures of it or whatever. I'd like to start this morning or this afternoon or whatever this is. I want to start with a story, a true story. And I wrote the story down and I left paper somewhere. So I'm just going to have to trust my memory. But it's a true story, and for those of you who do not know what truth is, it's a true story because it illustrates my point. So, gosh, I didn't even know that was funny. Okay, don't startle me like that. Okay, so it's a story about someone that I think you all recognize. Because it's a legal case, I will allow that person to remain nameless, but a famous biology professor was on the witness stand in a trial. And what had happened was he had been in an accident and badly injured. And so the other guy's insurance was refusing to pay for his medical expenses, which if you've seen the guy, you know that he still needs help, medical help. And the attorney in cross-examining him said, is it true, sir, that you told the state trooper at the scene of the accident that you were not injured? Yes, sir, that's true. Well, then, would you please explain to us why you're claiming now hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical expenses? And he said, well, yeah, I'll try to do that. So he told him, he said, well, I was riding my favorite horse, Thunder, and there's the person who, he used to be Latino until he switched. And he said, I was on a gravel road riding my horse down the road, and suddenly this idiot English professor comes, or humanities, I don't know. Olena, what are you anyway? Okay. Comes speeding down the road, and he hits my horse and me and knocks us for a loop. And Thunder's laying on one side of the road, and I'm laying on the other side. And he said, God blessed us. There was a state trooper just a moment behind, and the state trooper immediately stopped, got out of his vehicle. I want to tell you, it is the Dickens finding pictures of this on the internet. You try it. And the state trooper stopped, and he walked over to Thunder, and he said, I was in and out of consciousness because I was so badly injured. And he said, just a few seconds later, I heard a gunshot. And then the state trooper walked over to me, and he said, how about you, bud? Are you injured? And I said, no. No, sir. Okay, what's the point? Here's the point. Come on, get to a point. In any proposition that you consider to be true, your decision about it will depend, at least in part, on the context, and it will depend on, do you have an agenda? And everyone has an agenda. Listen to me. The worst people to have an agenda are science professors, and worse than them are philosophy professors, and worse than them are people who teach in the other humanities. Okay, this comes up a little bit more, a little bit later, but here it is. It probably started Professor Smedley even before Aristotle, but I like to be able to blame everything I can on them. That Aristotle was trying to find, well, what's the difference between knowledge and opinion? Can we draw a sharp line? There's that line, straighter than the one I drew on the board. The one I drew on the board was as straight as I can draw a line. Is there one that separates true knowledge or certain knowledge from opinion? And later it came to be, well, is there something that we can say that we're rather certain is true versus opinion that may be true or it may just be false? Dr. McCorkle has the attitude that all his opinions are true and knowledge. Okay, moving right along. This became what we call the demarcation problem, and I'll summarize it in a minute. for those of you who haven't figured it out yet. But is there a sharp line of demarcation between science and non-science? Is there a border? So probably one of the longest borders, I'm trying to aim this at Professor Nelson, because until now his face has registered no recognition of, I know what you're talking about. So this is that border between the U.S. and Mexico. You can find it on the internet. So the difference, and again for Professor Nelson's benefit, I'm trying to distinguish science from non-science, not science from nonsense. Got it? Okay, so some of you might be asking, why? What do I care? I don't care to know if there's a border between science and non-science. I don't care about either one of these because all I study is theology. Or history. Or psychology, which is the study of sighing. Study that, you psychology major. Well, Sven Hansen, is that a Norwegian name, Dr. Tennyson? Yes. Thank you. Let me be a little more respectful. He came up with 4 groups of reasons why someone might want to be able to draw a border between science and non-science. One of them has to do with healthcare, which if you add an S in the middle of Obamacare, it comes out Obama-scare. I'm not going to reveal any of my political prejudices. It can be important in expert legal testimony, and we're going to see an example of that toward the end of this presentation that's way too long. Environmental policy, something that I'm sure Dr. Tennyson could stand and don't do it, but could talk about for a long time. Why do we have the policies that we have regarding the environment? And finally, something that everyone here cares about, and that is science education. This is, if I didn't have this, I would have to say I plagiarized this from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the online edition. Is that a good book, Professor Smidley? I'm sure you've read the whole thing. Do you have articles in it? Do you have articles in it?
I've read articles in it.
Okay, I have an article in it. My copy, the very last page was blank. I wrote it right in there, man. Okay, so the whole idea behind a demarcation, behind this having a border, identifying what that border is so that we can distinguish real, genuine science from non-science, and then something else, something we call pseudoscience. And pseudoscience is not necessarily the same as non-science. Pseudoscience parades as science, and some people think it's science when it's not. Well, unless you say there is no border, in which case you can either conclude everything is science or you conclude nothing is science. And both of those may be right. So here's the way I write the question, and you can see the border in red, Professor Nelson. What is it, if there is indeed anything, what distinguishes the sciences from the other disciplines like history or theology? I want to be careful. I was really hoping, but I don't see Dr. Sutton here. Am I right, Dr. Sutton is not here? Heck, I don't have to be careful. Other than Dr. McCorkle gave me a list of bad words not to use in here today. So I memorized it. So Alistair McGrath. How many of you have never heard of Alistair McGrath? Several of you? Okay. Alistair McGrath. Now how many of you have never heard of him? Okay, I've corrected that problem. Hey, I can go home. I'm a teacher. I have time. Alistair McGrath is Irish. He's got a DPhil is the same as what we would call a PhD here in the States. He is Irish, English. He earned a PhD in molecular biophysics at Oxford University, that's in England, and he earned a Doctor of Divinity. And the guy is brilliant, but look at that face. Does he look like he is a wise guy? A smart aleck? Yeah? Okay. Smug. And I don't know why. About a face only mother could love. You finished reading that? I want to keep going. So here's something I learned from Alistair McGrath. years ago, if you had asked me, just a few years ago, maybe 2 or 3, I would have said, well, yeah, here's what happened. In the late 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, the sciences, I'm talking about the real sciences, okay? Not in any order, I'll put them in alphabetical order. Physics, chemistry, biology, these are the sciences. But what happened was the sciences were so successful that everybody and his brother stuck the word science onto their discipline to gain the currency that the sciences had. I was wrong. I did not know that. I have learned from Alistair McGrath that I was mistaken, and so I will correct that. I would have said social sciences. Oh, yeah. Do you mean social studies? Right. Behavioral sciences. Do you mean wacko? Okay. How many psychology majors in here? Have you ever noticed that it is psychology majors who typically need it the most? Gosh, I'm glad Dr. Sutton's not here. He would hurt me. Okay, so here's what I learned from McGrath. The word science has not always been limited to the so-called hard sciences, which are called hard. If you've had a science course, you know why they're called hard. Okay? Early on, when the natural sciences were coming into existence, any organized body of knowledge or an intellectual discipline was referred to as a science. Professor Little, what discipline was known as the queen of the sciences?
Theology.
Okay, and that has since been corrected. Am I right? What do you call it now? The king of the sciences? King, yeah, okay. Okay, well, it was about 1867 when Professor Little was in elementary school that this change, English is so dynamic. It changes so quickly. Words that used to mean one thing now mean another thing. I'd give you examples, but I don't have time. I could talk about asking the lady at the store to show me where the khaki pants are, and she brought me to blue Dockers. Khaki is a color, not anymore. Okay, the girl at Best Buy, I need to get a legal pad, and she showed me a letter size pad. No, I need a legal pad. Says right on it, legal pad. Legal is a size. It's not a color of paper. Anyway, it was McGrath that taught me that early on, anything that was organized knowledge and usually had some method was a science. But in the 1860s, and it probably was connected to the Civil War. I hope we don't have any historians here that probably call that science too. But it was about that time, shortly after the Civil War, that the word science took on this narrow meaning. And what did it mean? It meant the real sciences as we know them. Chemistry, physics, biology. Okay. The changes, by the way, in German, for those of you who care, anybody here care about German or Dutch? I don't either. Those changes, this change did not take place in those words. They would still just use a word for science to mean almost anything. Okay, well, with that in mind, in the spirit of critical thinking, you should not just accept that, in spite of McGrath being Irish or having 2 doctorates or being Anglican or talking or looking funny. You should think for yourself, well, I want to know more, so I'm going to teach you more. And you think you got here not knowing? When you leave here, you'll know even less. Okay. Whoa! Okay. Trying to remember who did this. I know. Who did that? Oh, yeah, okay. Furring. God will punish you. Okay, so today, when we say the natural sciences, we're talking about either the physical sciences, like chemistry and physics, and subdisciplines like astronomy. What else is in physics? Optics, thermo's in chemistry too, and chemistry and its subdisciplines, and then the life sciences, all the biological sciences and their subdisciplines. How many biology majors we have in here? It is not too late to change to chemistry. Okay. Some people would include the social sciences and the behavioral sciences, but honestly, in my experience everywhere I've been, people who are biologists or chemists or physics typically don't. And people in the social sciences and in the behavioral sciences are insulted, which is pretty handy sometimes. Okay. So here's where we have the demarcation problem. It stated in some questions. Is there a descriptive list of criteria that would describe only the sciences? Is there a clear boundary, think border, that separates science from non-science and or science from pseudoscience? And I've thought of these. Guys, what you're getting is a very early version of a paper that I hope and plan to present in June of 2014 at the second annual Faith and Science Conference, which was initiated and is the baby of our own Dr. Michael Tennyson. Yay. So far, he's allowed me to serve on the steering committee, but the way I drive, I may not get to steer anymore. But I hope to present this there. And one reason why I want to present it is there are some people here, and you may be one of them, who can give me some feedback on how to improve this. Obviously, you're not seeing the paper. What you're seeing is a PowerPoint subset of the paper. So, to state it in terms that Professor Smidley might use, is there a list of criteria, a list of necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be labeled science? And if it doesn't meet those criteria, then you can call it whatever you want to. You can call it an airport. You can call it a bus. We live in America. We can call it anything we want to, except for we cannot use the words that Dr. McCorkle put on that list for me. Now, the first time I heard this, I'm pretty sure I was an undergraduate, and I heard, oh yeah, like, right, a philosopher is going to define science. That is so funny. Well, of course they have a demarcation problem. They're asking the wrong person. They need to ask a scientist. Duh. We could answer it just like that. Well, I was wrong about that too. I just thought they were stupid for asking a philosopher, and actually I was showing my own ignorance. So this is my perspective when I was even in my 20s and perhaps even in my early 30s. I'm not using these like political. I don't even know which one's Republican, red or blue, and really don't care. That's much better than the word you told me not to use, isn't it? I really don't care. But science and non-science have this sharp line of demarcation. The border's very plain. Science is over here, non-science is over here, and anyone who studies it knows this. That was but all I did was display my ignorance, the fact I did not know. So what makes a philosopher better equipped? If it weren't for time, I would have Professor Smidley or even our own Dr. Olina stand and explain this, but both of them talk way too long, so I'll explain it to you in a way that even the biology majors could understand this. And it's actually J.P. Moreland, a Christian who is a philosopher, that I'm paraphrasing here. He said, rightly so, scientists are trained in making first-order observations, evaluations, conclusions. It's philosophers who are trained in making what we call second-order observations and evaluations. And it is they who are able to wrestle with this question. As a matter of fact, most of the practicing scientists with whom I have worked, I don't mean in academia, I mean like at Environmental Protection Agency, at United States Department of Agriculture, at, there's another one, National Marine Fisheries Service. They have never, and they don't want to, read or think anything about philosophy. Philosophy is pretty much a waste of time to them, to their own loss. How many of you have had a philosophy course? And it was pretty much a waste of time, too. Okay, because it was the way they teach it nowadays. It has nothing to do with the subject. It's the teachers. Okay, So there are different approaches, and there's almost nothing in here that is new with me, unique, novel with me. This is. So this is probably the stupidest thing up here. Early on, I was thinking, so how do we attempt to answer it? Well, honestly, what happens is many of the people, scholars who start off studying history of science, they study a lot of philosophy of science. And some of them, like Thomas Kuhn, can you help me with any names here? Brandon, no names. Doug, any names? Quine?
Well, Lester.
Who? McGrath, there you are. Excellent. I'm glad I thought of that. But what they do is they study what do the practitioners, what have they been doing for 100, 200 years. We'll study them and we'll see what their methods are, and then we'll help them to understand what they're doing. There are, in my opinion, there are some people who, instead of taking this this descriptive approach, what's going on in science, they take a prescriptive approach. And they say, this is what should be happening. That's the way my major professor was when I was in graduate school. He was always telling me what I should be doing and the way I should be doing it. And since he was the boss, that's what I did. But let me move on to something else. Here I'm getting back to agenda. Just imagine are you imagining? Well, let your face express, I'm imagining. Just imagine that I'm talking to some poor physics major at MSU who never had a philosophy course and is probably an atheist anyway. And this person is trying to convince me that there is a border between science and non-science. Early on, I might ask her, why do you want to establish a boundary? Because her agenda might be, I want to establish a boundary so that you will agree with me that something is not science. For instance, and here I'm neither arguing for or against this, I'm just using it as an example. For instance, many have said creation science. That's not science. Some have said acupuncture or chiropractic or the Bible code or, help me here, guy. Oh, astrology, okay? Which you know is pretty scientific, isn't it? That's not science, or maybe there's a specific proposition that they're wanting to convince you is not science. Maybe it's true, but it ain't science. Okay. So here's what you might be able to leave after this slide. If you do, it just shows that you're coming under conviction, and you haven't, or maybe you haven't understood anything, Tony, and so you're getting up leaving early, right? Both theists and atheists agree when they answer the question. And this is a quote from J.P. Moreland, but it could be from almost anyone who studies it. There is no clear-cut boundary or border between science and non-science. There is no list of necessary and sufficient conditions. Were you sweating it? You're wondering if I was going to conclude. And let me tell you, here's the only right way to distinguish between the two. Okay. So with that in mind, I would like to begin our thought today with epistemology. Okay?
Begun.
I'm sorry?
You've already begun. You began 21 slides ago.
Did you raise your hand? You're trying to get even with me, aren't you? Okay. It's not enough to raise your hand. You have to wait till I call on you. So what word would you prefer, Dr. Tennyson?
Continue with.
Yes? Okay. That's what I have. Okay. So let's continue with epistemology. Oh my gosh. Okay. How many of you have never heard of epistemology? Quick learners, huh? Okay. So Christian philosopher, and I'm using Christian in the very broadest sense. My friend Dallas Rourke is retired. He's Baptist, but he's still, I think he's probably genuinely saved. But he's a philosopher, which may challenge the is he really saved? In his little book, Introduction to Philosophy, he describes three areas, three aspects of epistemology. It tries to understand what are the ways to knowledge or the sources of knowledge. What's the nature of knowledge, and how do we know the validity, the truthfulness? Is that a good enough description there, Professor? His face is always so blank, Doug. Help me out. Is that, you could use that, couldn't you? Copy, I'll give you this, okay? So with this in mind, and that's my source of knowledge, I know nothing about it. So basically, there are two truth tests that scientists use. One of them, and I'm trying to use simple words for, at least for the professors who are present, ladies. The correspondence test and the coherence test. The correspondence test just says if the proposition corresponds to reality, that's necessary. So if I come in dripping wet and my umbrella's dripping wet and I say it's not raining outside, you're probably not going to believe me, right? My brother never believed that I don't like ham. I was at his house one day, and after about my third or fourth piece of ham, he said, "I'm glad you don't like ham. If you did like it, I could not afford to feed it to you." See, so my speech did not correspond to the reality he was observing. And then there's a coherence test, and what this means is, think of a system of knowledge, a lot of different propositions. If one part of it contradicts another part of it, they don't hang together, they don't cohere. And most of us would agree, I agree anyway, that the first one is a necessary, do I have that up here? Yeah, I do. First one is necessary and maybe a sufficient condition, but the correspondence is necessary if not sufficient. If we have, if it doesn't cohere, then we say, you know, something's wrong here. Okay, with this in mind, we're going to move into making sure you understand what empiricism is. Empiricism. Have you ever noticed the older scientists and philosophers, they always have weird haircuts and they're relatively ugly? Have you noticed that? You should see, who is it? Looks like he got hit in it's Avogadro. Looks like he got chopped in the forehead with a hatchet and it didn't heal straight. But look at that haircut. I mean, do you know anyone today besides Dr. Tosh with a haircut like that? I don't know. And they have surgery for noses like that. Okay. So in his little book in 1960 something, oh, here it is, 66, and it is considered a classic. On the very first page, he wants to make sure you understand that by science, he's talking about a dependence on empirical evidence. This distinguishes the empirical discipline sciences from the non-empirical disciplines. They may still be disciplines, but they ain't science. Okay, and you know, I shouldn't talk about him. He's deceased, isn't he? Never talk about the dead like that. Okay, so empiricism is talking about knowledge that we gain through the physical senses or an extension of a physical sense. And he would argue if a statement is testable, it's scientific. If it's not testable, it's not scientific. Which both of these, the verification principle, falsification principle, in a minute, we're going to get to that. Both of these are based on empiricism, okay? They're both based on, can I test it? In a nutshell, we can make a statement like, Pluto is made up of cream cheese. Is that a testable statement? Yeah, it's testable. We could test that, at least in principle. And so it would be scientific. On the other hand, make a statement like, there are some scientific facts that are some subatomic particles that are so tiny we will never discover them. Is that testable? No. So it's non-scientific. It may sound brilliant, but it's according to this criterion. So no one uses TVP for the verification principle, but I got very tired of typing it. There was a group in Vienna. What was it called, Professor Olina? There was a group of philosophers in Vienna in the 20s and 30s.
Yes.
The Vienna. That's the only thing that was coming to my mind. Is that it? Circus? Circle. The Vienna Circle, these philosophers that were known as logical positivists embraced for a while the verification principle. And here's, you've never heard, I'd name some of them. You don't even know who they are. If you did, you wouldn't care. None of them, trust me, were named Schmidley, Olina, McCorkle, Tennyson. I think there was one named Badger. Rudolf Carnap.
That's right.
Yeah.
Also, Wittgenstein for a while.
No, Wittgenstein?
Yes, Wittgenstein.
Frau Blocher, maybe. Okay, we got to hurry here. Philosophers, am I right, Schmidley? Philosophers generally do not embrace the verification principle with good reason. And we'll talk about the reason in just a minute. And it's not as widely supported as it used to be. However, scientists as a group will still parrot this because that's what they read in a dictionary somewhere or in a textbook somewhere, or they were taught probably by a biology person. Here's a definition here, or here's an abbreviation of it. A proposition, a statement that claims something, a proposition is true, or if you prefer, is meaningful, which is what the Vienna Circle would say. Either because, number one, it's analytic. Does this analytic and synthetic, does that go back to Aristotle? It does? Yeah, I would guess. Has nothing to do with what you think of analytic and synthetic. It's either an analytic proposition, which means it's a definition, or it's because of the way it's defined, or it's synthetic and can be empirically verified. So here's an analytic statement. All unmarried men are bachelors. That just depends upon the meaning of the word bachelor, right? If bachelor meant something else, it may not be true. But here, all unmarried men are bald. Dr. Tennyson is married. If you get my point. Okay. So for decades, this verification principle was the foundation of the natural science says, and people believed it. Okay, did you do this? Okay, I was in graduate school here. This was before I was a hippie, and this was shortly after I was a hippie. I had just gotten a haircut and trimmed my beard. Okay. Falsification, does this? No, it doesn't work. The falsification principle says this, and the falsification principle was Karl Popper. And there were a lot of people who thought, oh, this is a great improvement. We cannot verify because we'd have to see every case to verify. But if we could find one false, if we could falsify it, which, Dr. Tennyson, do you still use that in biology lab?
Yeah.
Okay. It's been totally refuted. It's one of the stupidest things that anyone calling him or herself a scientist does. A proposition has meaning or is true. You guys know IFF? What's if IFF mean? If and only if. Okay, but it's not if, it's if. Okay? If it can be falsified, at least, again, some would argue in principle. Here's the point. Both of these principles are self-refuting. Take the verification principle, apply it to itself, it cannot be verified empirically. Take the falsification principle, assume it's true. If it's true, it's false. Why? Because it's self-refuting. Okay, so Dr. Tennyson rebuked me years ago. We were talking somewhere, and he challenged me. Well, you know, what he did was he did not believe that that our students had a lick of sense. And he said, these children don't understand this. What do you mean by self-refuting? So if I were to say everything I say is false, if that statement is true, then that statement is false. If that statement is false, then that statement is okay. What are the other phrases for self-refuting, self-denying, self-denying? I'm talking jargon here, Dr. Tosh. You don't know any of this. Okay. I mean that in the best possible way. Self-denying.
Referentially incoherent.
Are you talking about me or this? Okay. Okay. Okay.
Same here.
Okay, I'm there. Or if some non-Christian gets mad at you and says, "Oh, you must never judge others," you should say, "Well, you just judged me. You just did what you told me not to do," and then you can say, "And you're going to hell." Oh, is that one of those words? It was, "You're going to Hades." Okay. So moving right along, Lakatos. This is a fascinating guy. He changed his name 3 times. He was Jewish, and in order to save his parents were murdered at Auschwitz by the Nazis. Any German people in here? Tosh is a German name, isn't it? He was Hungarian. He was a philosopher. He came up with this idea that, and you're going to say, I thought we were talking about the demarcation problem. Okay, well, let's just cut to the chase. He said, don't apply the demarcation or any demarcation criteria to a proposition. Apply it to a whole research program. And he was Hungarian, so he didn't know how to spell program. He spelled it programme. And in America, we've perfected it and lost the ME on the end. But the idea that he had that has some merit is don't try to establish something on the basis of 1 or 2 propositions as science or non-science. Look at the bigger picture and try to get an idea of the research program. So help me here. What was some of the research you did at Johnson? No, you were at Johnson, at Pittsburgh. Okay, when you were incarcerated in Pennsylvania, you got out of making license plates. What research program were you on? Glass, okay. And so someone might say the whole field of, but actually they wouldn't, because they would consider that a skill, and that doesn't fit the definition of science. That would be technology. So let's reject all engineers or engineer wannabes. Move right along here. So that was Lakatos. Look at him there. See, these old people. They're not like us kids. So he said, let's apply it to a research program. The research that they did on heart health, on diet and disease. Okay, well, moving right along. Okay, now that brings me to atheist, what's this guy's name? Michael Shermer, who's a very gifted writer, and he is an atheist. I'd tell you more about him, but I don't have time. But this book, The Borderlands of Science, here's what I see as his insightful contribution. Okay, forget that. He would say, look, between science and non-science, not a sharp line of demarcation, a broad border. And early on, some things might land on the border. And it may be a decade or a few or much later before we have enough information to say, oh, astrology, it sounded so scientific that we thought it was science. Now we know it's bogus, and it moves from the borderlands to non-science. Or the Bible code, which I don't know how familiar you are with the Bible code. It's hilarious. If I had time, I'd tell you about it. You'd get a kick out of it. But it's always been in non-science and in sad humor. Whereas, okay, name something that started on borderlands that we now know is science. Okay, well, not for you, but for physicians before 19, help me with the date, Tennyson, 60-something, no, 70-something, the whole thing on the health of the stomach and the duodenum, or if you're British, the duodenum, isn't that odd? Had to do what causes ulcers. Well, stress and diet, or worse yet, diverticulitis. You need to put people on a low fiber diet. Okay, well, low fiber diet makes diverticulitis worse in a hurry. They needed a high fiber diet. But the first person who stood up and said, oh, we've isolated a bacterium that causes ulcers, There were people got up and left. There were people got up and left and waved at the person making with a rude gesture. Okay, so Shermer says maybe there's a broad border. And if you want to read that, you can read it. Please remember I said he was an atheist. You never want to read anything by an atheist. Okay. So earlier on, question, comment?
I think if I remember right, Shermer came up out of an evangelical setting or even a Pentecostal setting. I have to double check on that.
I think you're right. And Alistair McGrath was an atheist. Obviously, that would be before he came to faith. Okay. Well, this brings us to a legal definition, and there's more than one court that has attempted to define. So I'm just going to rattle through this real quick. There's a picture of J.P. Moreland, another person who's a friend. He's from a suburb of Kansas City, Lee Summit. He, if you're wondering why he doesn't look weird like the rest of them, it's because he got his bachelor's degree in chemistry at the University of Missouri. Then he went over to the dark side, philosophy. And so from this book, Christianity and the Nature of Science, he took a judge. And I was really going to mock this judge, but I just found out an hour or two ago he's deceased. And I had to ask for some help because they called him the late judge. And I'm thinking, so? Okay, so on the advice of philosophers like Michael Roos, he decided that in hearing this, it's a creation science case in Arkansas, that he was able to determine that creation science is not science according to these criteria. So Dr. Moreland said, well, let me take these 5, and actually the first 2 are so close to each other, let's try to stick them together. And let me try to answer this. In a nutshell, he took these and he said, here's what Judge Overton should have said or was trying to say. That we can call something scientific if and only if it focuses on the natural world and is guided by natural law or is explained by reference to natural law. If and only if it can be tested against the empirical world. If and only if it can be held tentatively. If new evidence comes along, we'll change our minds. And if it is, there it is, falsification, if it's falsifiable. Interestingly, the word scientific in our culture is an honorific. If you can establish that something is scientific, I mean, have you ever watched TV? The ads? The underarm deodorant I use still working? That's because science has proven. You have a headache, 9 out of 10 scientists say brush your teeth with this. Guys, you'll get the girl. It worked for me. Okay, so on the other hand, to say that something is not scientific is a pejorative. Now, if you don't know what pejorative is, you need to write it down because you should know that if you're a college student. Now, here's what Moreland did. He said, let's take these 1, 2, 3, 4. First, for number 1, let me name something that we all agree is science, but it does not meet that criterion. Here's something we all agree is not science, but it does meet that criterion. He does that for number 2, does that for number 3, does that for number 4, and you'll be unhappy to know that Dr. Moreland concluded that there is no clear-cut definition of science. There is no sharp border. There's no list of criteria that will distinguish science from non-science. These were quoted from these pages of that book. Okay, and the point is simply this, and it's one that I think that you can use in the future. Dr. Pincombe, don't you think people can use this in the future?
If you make it disposable.
What did he say?
If you can make it disposable.
It is disposable, okay. I need to move to here. I wonder, okay, Cal, this is something unique with me. You might want to write this down. Sometimes I think in this whole demarcation problem, we need to stop focusing on the discipline, science, or some other discipline, and let's look at the practitioners, okay, practitioners, and evaluate them and what they're doing, and compare what the practitioners are of the different disciplines are doing. For instance, and trying to be serious, and I think I am serious, if I were to follow Dr. Jeff Sutton around for a while and say, let me see what you do, I would not be at all surprised if he would convince me that what he is doing is not parapsychology, and it's probably not, what do they call that, psychological evaluation stuff? I've been through it, I ought to remember it. Okay, well, who cares? But I would conclude much of what he does is science. Or if you prefer, even though chemistry and physics are almost pure science, right, Dr. McCorkle? Yes. What is done, for instance, in medicine is part science and part non-science. So it's not only science, but it's a practice of medicine. It's an art as well, right? Sure. If I had time, I'd talk about the kinds of things that are done in biology. My bachelor's degree is in biology. Then I had an epiphany. So some people say, here's what's the difference. When Professor Little goes into class, when he sits to read anything at all, whether it's the Bible or something written by a Christian or a non-Christian, he arrives with this long list of presuppositions. We scientists, we're the only ones who arrive at our observations with no presuppositions. Okay, good news, I don't have time. I'm not going to list the presuppositions, but that's balderdash. That was not one of the words on your list. I did remove that graphic you told me to remove so far. So it's baloney that scientists do science without any presuppositions. Of course we do. Okay, and you see, I said I wasn't going to list them. There they are. Read those in a hurry. Okay, there. See there, you can read this, and you can get his book, Introduction to Philosophy, free online. Dallas Rourke, the whole text, PDF, Word, whatever. Okay, so here are the implications, and this is where I want to provoke some Q&A, some comments from you. Larry Loudon wrote an article a few years ago entitled The Demise of the Demarcation Problem. And basically what he's saying is when it comes to philosophy of science, it's a dead issue. I don't care if there is an adequate border or not. We have worked this over so long fruitlessly that it doesn't matter. And then he or someone else says something like this. The only work done by scientific and the labels, scientific and non-scientific, he says it's emotive work. It makes you feel good that you can look at someone else and say, yeah, that stuff that you study, that's not scientific. What I do is science. Mine has value, yours doesn't. Yours is opinion. Mine is fact, and mine is empirically verifiable, even if the verification principle is not. So, calling something scientific or non-scientific, it doesn't accomplish anything. So maybe we need to use other labels. And this is where I'm hoping that Professor Pincombe-Schmidley and Olina will chime in a moment, and that is, I can tell you what someone says might be suitable terms, but what might we use instead of the labels science and non-science or scientific and non-scientific? And with that, oh boy, look at this, look at this. I only put this here that if someone like Dr. Turner said, what do you mean by constructivism? Then I'm ready to flip over and read that to him. Okay, so talk to me. What comments, questions, observations, and by the way, write this down. My email address is docbadger@gmail.com, and I would be happy to receive privately your criticism, rip it up, and send it back to you. So, and just try to show you the error in your thinking. But ways to make this better, you only got like 2/3 or a little over half of the kind of information I would hope to include in the paper, not in the presentation. Okay, thank you for holding your applause. And what are your comments, questions? Gigi, did you raise your hand? No. The light was blinding me. Yes.
Okay, what's the name of that book?
Which book?
The one
What?
A couple slides back.
Oh, Introduction to Philosophy? This one by Rourke? Do Rourke Introduction to Philosophy. You'll find it. It's probably several places as a PDF and or as a DOC file. Okay, have you any of you guys ever looked at that book? He wrote it and used it in a course he taught at Emporia State University. I think that's in Kansas. He's still in Kansas, even though he's retired. So, yeah, comments? See, now, do not do this. I think you're raising your hand. Don't do this or this. Okay, freeze if you don't. Yes, Dr. Pincombe. I have no idea what you were thinking of. Was that the question?
One of that, the big issue is intelligent design, right? And it would be nice to use that as a for instance about the demarcation.
You'll have to raise money. You'll have to pay money for the paper on that. But as a matter of fact, if Dr. Tennyson would, in just a minute, he can tell us. Dr. Stephen Meyer, philosopher who's a Christian, has a couple of papers available on the internet. And one of them, the first 5 or 6 pages, just covers the demarcation problem. And another one, he covers the demarcation problem. He's the founder of the Discovery Institute. And where? Seattle, yeah, Washington State. There you go. And he advocates intelligent design. And others say, well, intelligent design, that's just creationism and that's just religion in a different suit and tie. Yeah, and it's not science. And Dr. Tennyson, Meyer and others come back and say, okay, your argument is that it's not science because it doesn't make any testable predictions. Am I right?
And then he proposes some testable predictions.
Okay, I really didn't hear every word.
And then he
proposes, what, a half a dozen testable predictions.
Right.
And he says, well, that blows you out of the water. Go ahead and complain again. J.P. Moreland, in his book, says, if we cannot draw a border and say this is science and this is non-science, then shut up about complaining that creation science is not science. You can't even define science. So if you can't define it adequately, if you can't put a border around it and say, these are the necessary and sufficient conditions, then stop that argument and come up and say, what's the evidence for and against? And that's, I'm stealing thunder from Professor Zolina and the other one over there. So what would you think, Doug, on avoiding the pejorative not scientific or the honorific, well, that's scientific, and what labels could we use that maybe would be more descriptive if we can't define science?
I'm not sure that we'll find labels.
Yeah, this is
But
good.
what I think we do have
Philosopher, see?
is technology.
What?
When we have
That
technology
is-
engineers who actually produce things from our research that work, then we don't have to worry about whether it's true or not. We know it's true.
Are you on medication? You take 2 of these.
Than you.
No. I took 1, you take 2. Okay, what do you think, Professor Smidley? You're going to do better than that, aren't you?
So you can say there's no demarcation, but then you're back.
I've already said that.
Then you're back to what you said at the beginning. If we say that there's no demarcation, then the term science would become either meaningless in that nothing is science or everything is science. But clearly, there are some things that are science.
That's what J.P. Moreland says.
And clearly there's some things that we wouldn't put in. And so I think you're right that a lot of the times what people are doing are making an emotive assertion by calling something science or non-science. But I think that there's a relevant concern, and I think this would be what it is are there empirical processes and are there disciplines that engage the empirical world which we should trust their conclusions, and are there disciplines that are acting smart but really don't follow a process that we can trust, and the average person can't go around and investigate all of the various methods and say, this one does something that I should trust, this one doesn't. So then we just kind of defer to the experts. And if the experts call it science, that probably means it's doing something good. And if this one's being called non-science or pseudoscience, then maybe I shouldn't trust it. But if that's really the question, is something engaging in a process that's leading to conclusions that are likely to be true? Well, this goes on outside of the empirical investigation, various empirical investigation as well. But I think that's a worthwhile concern. What areas of research and investigation and study are following good processes that are leading to conclusions I should trust, and what areas aren't? And if I don't have the time to investigate them, then do we need to come up with a new label, or is this things like that's a worthwhile concern?
Yeah, that's much better than let me try to make up to my former friend over here that one of the reasons why I responded the way I did, Doug, was in a few issues back of what's the name of the ASA's journal, Kenny? Perspectives on science, faith and science. Perspectives on faith and science. Whatever. You should go. Science and faith. Okay. If you've never looked at that, you really ought to go thumb through some of the table of contents. But in a recent issue of that or another journal, there was an engineer, and this is not a slam against engineers. They're not scientists. They want to be scientists. That it was an engineer who was complaining that someone else would talk about science and technology as if technology is not science. Well, most people, especially scientists in the English-speaking world, we think of science as trying to gain the knowledge, and when we apply it, then we call it technology. And your language fit that rather perfectly, wouldn't you say? Let me translate by that. He meant yes. I learned that from my children. Yeah, no, yes, yes, no, yes.
What I intend is that when we actually get things to work physically, it means we don't have to ask the question about whether the knowledge that produced it is science or not.
Well, my computer doesn't work often, so that, and doesn't Mr. Mitchum call it computer science? Is he here? That is definitely not science. It's computer studies. Okay. Definitely. Okay. I don't know. Where does this go? Oh, there we go. If there's yes.
I was surprised that there would be some people who don't think that defining science is relevant. Because if you're saying it's a motive and you're saying that it doesn't really matter, you have people who say science is only empirical. And if you say that science is only empirical, isn't that limiting yourself as far as if you're looking for origin of like intelligent design or evolution or whatever it is, and you're limiting yourself in your realm of answers, if that makes sense?
Yeah.
If you're limiting yourself,
It's a lot better than.
doesn't that make you a bad scientist?
See, here's what happens, and I apologize, Professor Little, but I'll try to remember to get back to you. She's more important than you are right now. If whoever defines the terms wins the argument.
Yes, that's correct.
Can I get an amen?
Amen.
Oh. So if the authority, me, will define science as excluding religion, metaphysics, God, then as soon as you use anything non-empirical or spiritual or it sounds like deity, whoa, you left science, right? So then the question comes up, must science be defined in that way? And especially historians of science would say, hey, let's go back and let's look at our scientific roots. Not all, but the majority of them were theists or committed Christians. Some of them were very committed Christians. Many of them would put Dr. Tennyson to shame. Truly. Okay? So none of them were philosophers, but many of them were scientists. Actually, I'm wrong. Natural philosophy. They had, okay, well, let's see what Professor Little had on his mind.
Going back to way in the beginning of your presentation, where you talked about the fact that nobody, including no scientist, is agenda-free. I think it's very helpful in this whole demarcation question to educate ourselves as to how the research is being done. Case in point, coffee.
Whoa. You're not gonna slam coffee, are you?
Just an example.
Okay.
Think of all the studies that have come out in the last 10, 15 years on coffee. Doesn't say coffee's bad. It says coffee's good.
Can you switch to alcohol? Because I can really go with alcohol.
So this leaves the impression in the relatively well-educated population that science is just kind of willy-nilly, but if we understood a little bit more about how this study was done and how that study was done, we could kind of compare and have a better sense of whether we're really advancing knowledge about the benefits or the detriments of coffee.
Absolutely.
Or, any other example that we could use.
In the future, if you'd think of butter or eggs, either one, they're much better examples. Flip-flop. Butter was bad. Butter was good. Oleo was better than butter. Now butter's better than oleo. Eggs, do not eat eggs. Okay. And there are reasons for it. One of the things I did not talk about, and I can't talk about because I have to leave shortly, is how many of you have had a science course, high school here, I don't care. If you want to name the professor or turn around and look at Dr. Tennyson, I don't care. And you were taught the scientific method. Huh? Yeah? Okay. Well, anyone even half-versed or quarter-versed in philosophy of science knows that's a myth. And honestly, and I could allow Dr. Tennyson to say this too, he and I had been collaborating for 11 and a half years. And we'd been working together for some time, Turner, before I realized, and I should have known this is no compliment to me, that biologists and chemists, or if you prefer, biologists and physics, their methods are slightly different. Fairly put? Yeah, okay. And that's not a slam on either one of them, other than the physics, chemistry, and biology. Other than that, it's just the way it is. I wanted to ask you, Professor Little, your whole discipline. I would say my second discipline is biblical studies. I would never call myself a theologian, and no one who knows me would either. But in biblical studies has methods. In fact, I ate breakfast with a friend just this week in which he was telling me the difference between his hermeneutic and my old archaic hermeneutic. I'm stuck in the 50s. Well, heck, look at my age, man. I'm not likely to bounce out of it anytime soon, huh? That is just so passé. That's so yesterday. Okay, well, at least mine has the test of time, a few years. So if you have embraced the idea of a scientific method, you need to do some reading on this. Hey, I'm out of time. I went longer than I was supposed to. You can express your appreciation to Dr. McCorkle and Dr. Tennyson. If you did not like this, it's their fault.